Okay, so let's talk about college football rankings. The AP poll, the coaches poll, and the CFP rankings. These rankings have a serious impact from the cute little number on the score overlay to which matchups are featured to who eventually makes the playoffs. And with the playoffs expanding from 4 teams to 12 teams next year, I think it's all the more important that there be an objective, reasonable, and measurable way of ranking teams. And this has been said before, the current ranking system is pretty controversial.
But if you're going to have parity, you have to have a better way of figuring out who has the best teams. Not just because you lose 2 games on the last play of the game that knocks you out.
Now, as salty as that sounds, he is right. So today, I want to talk about why the current rankings kind of stink and propose a potential alternative. So, first off, how do the current rankings work? For the AP poll and the coaches poll, voters submit ballots of their own personal top 25 rankings, and points are allocated to each of those teams based on their placement. For example, 25 points for first place, 24 for second, and so on until the 25th place team gets 1 point per ballot. The CFP is done similarly, though the voters actually get together, have discussions, and rank teams in increments of 3 or 4 at a time. Now, I don't think these systems do a horrible job of ranking teams, but they do have a couple of problems. So let's go over those. So, one of the main problems with these rankings is that each week's ranking is very heavily based on the prior week's rankings. One issue with this is that teams will always drop after losing a game. And you might think that sounds pretty reasonable, but if it's number 20 against number 1, for instance, they are totally expected to lose that game, so they shouldn't necessarily drop for losing. The voters just usually feel the need to make whatever tiny adjustments that they can, even if they're unnecessary. And the next issue is actually the opposite problem, where if a team has a very glaring loss, they'll oftentimes not be dropped very far. There's almost like a maximum distance that a team can fall in the rankings from week to week. And this can lead to some very odd ranking situations. The next issue with basing your rankings heavily on prior week's rankings is that mistakes are almost never mitigated. If last week's rankings were bad, just wait until you see this week's rankings. If a team has a really impressive seeming win early in the season, only to see that that win doesn't look so impressive a couple games down the road, it's very difficult to lower their ranking retroactively because of that, even if they might still be winning their recent games. And these mistakes can go all the way back to the preseason polls, which, while preseason rankings are fun, they should have no bearing whatsoever on rankings during the season. And they very clearly do. Oftentimes, the preseason number 1 will stay number 1 until they lose, even if other teams have much better results. But it's hard to blame these voters for basing their results so heavily on what they said last time. There's over 130 FBS programs, and so it's actually impossible to be able to follow all the storylines. Oftentimes, voters will try and keep track of things by starting to measure somewhat arbitrary stats. For example, ranked wins. Ranked wins is a bad statistic for a couple reasons. For one thing, it's binary. A win either is or it isn't top 25 or top 10, even if there is no meaningful difference between the number 10 team and the number 11 team, or the number 25 team and the number 30 team. It's sort of an arbitrary cutoff. If you're going to use ranked wins, you also have to decide if you're going to use the rankings as they were going into the game or the rankings as they are now, which both have issues. If you use the rankings as they were going into the game, they could be completely wrong, especially if it was very early in the season. But if you use the rankings as they are now, you can run into other issues, like the team being unranked specifically for losing that game. But I can't really blame voters for using that statistic when it's so hard to keep track of all the teams. And when they aren't using somewhat arbitrary statistics, there's a very real possibility that they are using something far, far worse. It's called the eye test. Now, if you don't know what the eye test is, the eye test is where you watch a team and you say, I just kind of feel like they're playing pretty good. Or you say, they may be winning, but they don't look so hot to me. No, there's a little more to it than that. It's kind of a mixture of a person's feelings with statistics that they don't even realize that they're tracking or that may not be recorded very well. Like, for example, how accurate a quarterback is if he has to throw within 3 seconds. But allow me to pose a question, purely hypothetical. If there was a team out there who played the ugliest football that you have ever seen, but also forced their opponents to play super duper ugly football, and they won every time, wouldn't they be deserving of a really high ranking? Ugly football that wins. Well, that and the fact that having to watch every team that you want to rank screws group of five teams who get watched less. So now that we've gone over some of the problems with college football rankings, I'd like to go over the potential solution I'm proposing. Most people are familiar with the concept of transitivity from mathematics, which is the idea that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. And I have seen people apply basic version of it to sports too. If team A beats team B and team B beats team C, then it's generally thought that team A would theoretically beat team C if they were to be matched up. But what if we created rankings that were only based on transitivity and nothing else? So let's start off with a visual. We have all our teams drawn just kind of all over the place, and every time they play each other, we draw an arrow from the winner to the loser. And so as the teams get slowly more connected, if you can follow the arrows starting from one team leading to another team, then the first team has a transitive win, or a favorable matchup as we'll call it, over the second team. And the second team has a transitive loss, or an unfavorable matchup against the first team. Now you may ask, what happens if one team beats a team who beats a team who beats a team who beats a team who beats the first team? What if we have a circle? And the answer is, if two teams both have paths to each other, then the one who has the shorter path to the other will get the favorable matchup. In other words, if they have the more direct transitive win over their opponent, then they'll get the favorable matchup. And there may be multiple paths from one team to another, but we'll only be looking at the shortest path, the most direct win. And if both of the teams both have the same length shortest path to each other, then neither one is given a favorable matchup over the other. Alright, so every team has a list of favorable matchups and unfavorable matchups. So how are we going to turn that into a ranked list of teams? Since I don't want there to be any ties, we'll have a bunch of tiebreaker criteria. But our first criterion, our primary criterion, is percent matchups favorable. That number is the number of favorable matchups divided by the sum of the number of favorable matchups and the number of unfavorable matchups. That's a good statistic because if you extrapolate that, it's the probability that we think that if you put them against any random opponent, that they are expected to win based on the matchups that we know. And there will definitely be ties with that statistic because undefeated teams will have no unfavorable matchups, and winless teams will have no favorable matchups. So they'll be 100% and 0% respectively. So our first tiebreaker statistic is matchup differential, which is favorable matchups minus unfavorable matchups. What that means is that if two teams have a tied favorable matchup percent, if that percent is above 50, then the team with more matchups overall will be on top. And if it's below 50, the team with fewer matchups overall will be on top. It's done that way because we want to reward certainty about being good, and we want to punish certainty about being bad. There may still be a few ties after this, so we'll add in a couple more tiebreakers. Win percent, win differential, and finally, win streak. I don't think these will be used often, but I think once we're at this point, the teams have the exact same matchup spread. I think we can go off their actual wins. And I generally don't like the idea of focusing too much on recency because it can really hurt teams that have a backloaded schedule. But I think that win streak or losing streak is fine as a final tiebreaker statistic if it comes down to the wire. And you might say, wait a minute, if a team wins by a lot, doesn't that mean something more than if they win in ninth overtime? Doesn't margin of victory matter? No. Okay, now let me try and convince you that that's the right decision. First of all, teams don't play to maximize score. Once it's apparent they're going to win, they'll oftentimes put in bench players, they'll start running out the clock, because their primary goal is to win this game and their secondary goal is to prepare to win the next game. Second of all, every good team has close games, and those close games don't necessarily come against good teams. Third, I don't believe there's any such thing as flukes. I believe that the better team finds a way to win. And finally, any biases towards in-game statistics can reward certain playstyles more than others. But the only playstyle I'm interested in rewarding is winning. Well, that, and I haven't thought of a good way to incorporate margin of victory into this system. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go over a couple of other potential concerns. 1. Since the teams are ranked by favorable matchup percent, doesn't that mean that undefeated teams are always at the very top and winless teams are always at the very bottom? Well, yes. No matter the schedule, a team who's undefeated will always be above a team that has a loss. And since we've already established that margin doesn't really matter here, I think that makes sense. Because if margin doesn't matter, then simply winning all your games is the best possible performance that you could have. We have no evidence that an undefeated team is even capable of losing. And it's not like a team can suddenly realize that they're good midway through the season and decide to make their schedule harder. Throughout the years, there have been a number of teams who have finished the season undefeated, yet not been invited to the playoffs. Winning all of your games is never easy, no matter what conference you're in. And there's no point in a team actually even being in the FBS subdivision if they're not allowed to be in the playoffs after winning all of their games. If it's their destiny to get absolutely blown out in the playoffs, then so be it. And that's one of the great things about the playoff expansion is that there's definitely going to be room for pretty much every undefeated team at the end of the season. So next, you may ask, will FCS teams be included in any way? And the answer is yes and no. While FCS teams do not compete for the same championship as FBS teams, there is a lot of crossover between the two. We could theoretically include all of the FCS teams into the rankings, but I'm not going to. If an FBS team were to beat an FCS title contender, then they would get tons of favorable matchups for free against teams that they wouldn't be competing with for a title and who they should never realistically lose to. So I will actually be including FCS teams, but I will only be including their games against FBS opponents, and they will be excluded from the final rankings list. So beating or losing to an FCS team means that an FBS team will just gain one additional matchup. That is, unless the FCS team has played another FBS team during the season and has beaten them. I don't know if that's ever actually happened. FCS teams rarely play more than one FBS opponent per season. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about rematches. FBS rematches are pretty uncommon, but they do happen, most commonly when two conference opponents play each other during the regular season and then they play each other in the conference championship. In this system, a rematch will simply overwrite the previous result. And I think that since it is another game against an opponent who you've played before, it is appropriate to favor recency in this case. And so those are the basics. I'm really excited about this system because it just seems very fair. All teams start on the same level. They don't start off with any hype, and all of the over 130 FBS teams get a placement. And I'm really hoping that in general it creates rankings that are similar to the rankings that are presently used, because again, I don't think they're awful, but I want it to be different in the areas where it matters, where I think the current systems fail. I'll try and have tweaks and updates as the season goes on, if I can find any improvements that I can make. So, with that said, let's take a look at a sample ranking. They'll be outdated kind of quickly, but I think it's important to be able to point out a few things. They're the rankings going into week 8 of the 2023 season. I'll show the AP poll from that same week to be able to highlight the differences. I think one of the cool things is that teams will be placed pretty much as best as they can be between the teams that they beat and the teams they lost to. And that can't always happen because, like we discussed before, there are circles, but it is generally true. And you can see that in these rankings. And I think that it will change a lot as the season goes on, but it's true for the top 25 here. We can see at the top we have all the undefeated teams, followed by the teams that have only lost to undefeated teams, and then teams that have only lost to those teams, and so on. And then at number 25, we have
Well, Mr. Funny Man, is this how you get your sick kicks?
What? It's just an ordinary crabby. Oh my goodness!
Now, before you get mad about Utah State, let me just talk about their schedule. The whole point of using transitivity is to give an extremely heavy weight to schedule so that teams with a brutal schedule are rewarded for having a brutal schedule and not penalized. In this ranking, Utah State has wins over number 49, Colorado State, number 108, Connecticut, and Idaho State, who is FCS. On the other hand, Utah State has lost to number 2, Air Force, number 7, James Madison, number 13, Iowa, and number 19, Fresno State, and is placed below all of them. But, of course, one of the beauties of these transitive rankings is that they are self-adjusting, so should any of those 4 teams start to lose later in the season, Utah State will be pushed below them. And I think that's pretty cool. I think it creates engagement. You want your team's opponents to do well in general, whether or not they end up beating your team, because it improves the strength of schedule. Georgia Tech versus Boston College is actually one of the things that ended up tanking USC. But as conference play continues, I think that will allow more information to be revealed and things to settle down a little bit. The rankings were hardly meaningful before week 4 anyways, because there wasn't a lot of interconnectivity between the teams, so I'm excited to see where things go from here. So let me know what you guys think, and if you have any suggestions, and that's all for today.